Hello, everybody. Tonight I was going to be talking about a film and kind of a theater project that I'm working on, and also kind of a refugee project that I was working on, particularly to help Russian refugees who do not want to be involved in the war or necessarily want to look for some alternatives. So it's not necessarily against or for Russia, it's about trying to help people as various types of refugees from conflict. So this script is only about 35 pages long, but I'll kind of highlight some of the main key ideas here in the story. I'll just go through everything really quick so you can kind of see. You can probably pause this, try to translate it to Russian and Portuguese as well. But the central idea for this whole film has to do with there was a book that was written called The Heart of Darkness. It was one of the most important books ever written about Africa. And it was really... I actually have not read the book in completeness, but I have kind of looked through the details. And there's also another book, famous book about India in terms of early 1900s, and so many parts of the world were really unknown, and there's only a few parts of the world that are left as completely unknown. Some of those are actually in the Amazon jungle, and some of that also is probably also very deep in the Amazon jungle. So I'm going to be up and about during this conversation, so I'm going to try to be pausing this for a full recording, so it's kind of hard to get all the details just in one kind of momentary thing. So I'm going to try to read the chat and talk with people if there are some questions through the whole thing. I was thinking this might be fun to do this like almost every other night or so, and try to go through a couple different of these film projects that I'm trying to work on to see if others are interested in possibly helping out working on the film. This is me live right now. I'm doing this on Facebook and YouTube. I'd like to also do it on some Brazilian channels too. I used to live down in Rio de Janeiro for about a year and traveled around South America, so I'm pretty familiar with South America. And also I've been to Mexico and some other places, but just wanted to kind of talk with some people here. So one of the interesting problems in modern society is that we have all kinds of refugees now. And whether you're black, you're white, whatever color you might be, there's all kinds of problems that people are facing right now, particularly with technology, with war, conflict, food, poverty, whatever you can think of. There's always some kind of problem out there. So some of the history is actually not known, and it really surprised me. I want to bring you a map here. We're going to load it up. I'm going to take a little bit, Google Earth, but I never took history in college, so it was something that totally new, kind of blew my mind when I talked with a friend of mine that did take history, European history, and he told me that large parts of Southern Europe actually used to be very white. In fact, Italy, Rome, Greece, a lot of the early history used to be very white, and then there was kind of this refugee problem where different people all kinds of Europe changed and became very multicultural, which it is today. But actually, a lot of the white people moved up into the Arctic and to other areas, for example, Russia. So this is actually kind of a weird story because it discusses how all people are essentially refugees. And the concept of black refugee, white refugee, all of that is very important no matter who you are, and to try to see how to help everyone out. And this is kind of perhaps one of the world's first films on that topic of basically a white refugee. So my aunt started kind of working on a film project. Another guy from Los Angeles kind of helped me out, disappeared from my life, and got involved in explaining to me what film was all about. You'll see a little bit like Russian words here in some of this script dialogue here. But basically this is kind of a magical story, and it's actually something that kind of changed my mind about how the planet actually works. So on this map, you're going to see quite a lot of earthquakes and a lot of different features of the planet, maybe that you've never even seen before. But there's actually kind of a mysterious area on the planet where we get the most lightning. So as I started to study the planet, I learned different things about the planet and kind of learned all kinds of different weird facts. Let me try to remove some of this, because some of this is going to be just too much information to see on this one map, and it gets to be hundreds of thousands of earthquakes, which basically slows down everything on the whole entire conversation. So I'm going to take back some of these earthquakes, and this is going to be primarily just the earthquakes that are 5.0 and plus. So these are very significant earthquakes in general, and hopefully the map will move around a little bit easier. But what I wanted to bring up is this weird concept that there's actually quite a lot of lightning right in this lake right here called Lake Maracaibo. So I don't know if you remember, there was that whole terrible phenomena where we had these crazy presidents. We had crazy things going on everywhere around the world. Now it's also happening in Russia, and basically there's some times have changed. The West is kind of now actually becoming a refugee from their own system that has been created. So let me just fast forward to the story so I can tell you what the whole premise of the story is. So the basic story is that some people in Moscow decide that they're kind of wanting to, they're trying to, not necessarily, we have to be very careful about the way we talk about this, because we don't want to hurt anybody that's potentially going to get involved with the film project, and we want to keep everything 100% legal, both from the Russian side and as well as from the international side. But basically these are white refugees from Russia, whether they've been captured prisoners in Ukraine, or they've actually been, they figure out a way to go to Turkey. And one thing I noticed on the international flights is that if you look at the live flight map, 24-hour flight aware, let me just do this really quick so you can see the live flight tracker. You'll notice that Moscow is not flying everywhere in the world right now on the global flight map. And that's really sad, because basically that means that people cannot actually even leave their own country, and they're having to find complicated ways to get out. That's not true, though, because what happens is that there are certain airports that are still working with Moscow. One of those is in Turkey. And it turns out that Russia is actually very much part of the Middle East. So if you know anything about the history, is that the Middle East has actually become quite a conflict zone, and that's perhaps partly due to the fact of so much land being part of Russia, and maybe Russia needs to start working more closely with the Middle East to feed people in the Middle East and not only feed themselves. And actually Ukraine is, what I heard, is almost 50%, at least 30% of the world's wheat supply actually comes from Ukraine. So you'll notice there's actually no flights going over Ukraine right now. So basically what happens is the flights there are Russian kind of go around the bout and have certain kind of secretive airports that they land in. So what I discovered is there's Istanbul Airport here, and there's actually they've actually even shut it down recently. I don't know if I'm even allowed to talk about this or what the situation is technically. I don't want to be involved in any type of problem whatsoever. I want to try to help people get to safety and work together on, basically unite, whether it's a united Russia with Ukraine or whatever we want to, however you perceive the world to be. So I think it's very important to respect international borders as well. So anyway, I think that, you can see that this airport is being used right now and this airport is not being used. So you'd have to look up, back when I wrote the script originally, I think both airports were being used. So now they've actually shut down one of the airports. So anyway, but the point is they fly to Istanbul. If you know anything about the Middle East, it's actually very Muslim, and actually even certain parts of, recently Putin, I think, went down to Azerbaijan, and actually his house is actually located, I think, right, he has several houses, and some of them are like in Sochi and other areas that are actually not even close to Russia. So I think part of it is that when Russians vacation down here, they like this area so much that they kind of wanted the rest of the land here. Because they really have cold environment overall. So it'd be nice for people to share their land a little bit more. And a lot of the wealthy Russians have actually moved to Ukraine, so they've actually took a lot of the wealth, similar to what's going on in Taiwan with China. Like the semiconductor industry has really been changed a lot. So back to the story. This story has to do with fleeing, and there actually is a weird side of the story because I started to feel so guilty that Africans are so wise. Africans have so much awesomeness when it comes to the jungle. They live directly in the jungle. They have all kinds of interesting. Sorry, I was looking at Hong Kong earlier today, but I wanted to show you how interesting Africa is. So Africa, this is a big part of the jungle right here. We have lakes, we have giraffes, we have tigers, monkeys, all kinds of monkeys. We have thousands of types of monkeys. I thought there was, when I first started studying monkeys, I was like, oh, there's maybe 10, 20 types. There's thousands and thousands of types of monkeys. And basically, Africans are living all around in the jungle. Now, so they have the luxury of living in the jungle. Now, white people, should they live in the jungle? I think probably not. But the story is about white refugees who basically try to flee to Brazil. So the concept here is that in the film, they fly to Turkey out of Moscow, which is up in here. This is Moscow. It's actually the largest city in all of Europe. It's considered part of Europe because the Ural Mountains basically run over through here. I think it is somewhere. Yeah, so actually, technically, I consider this part to be Russian and this part to be Middle Eastern, but that's all part of Russia, technically, at least in terms of the maps right now. So there's definitely some interesting questions here. So basically, they fly to here and they basically convert to Islam. And then they decide to go and start up both a temple as well as a grocery store in a city called Macapa, Brazil. So it's actually right over here. It's a really small city at the end of the Amazon. So I wanted to be sure, and there's another major city called Belém over here, and we can actually film here. It's probably easier to film in Belém than it is Macapa, so we might actually do most of the filming in here and then some of it here. And they started to start up a zero waste grocery store. So the whole idea is that these white people want to try to live here in Brazil, and somewhat illegally, somewhat illegally. We want to try to keep everything 100% legal. And there is a lot of restrictions on how to film in Brazil. But this becomes part of the jungle. And what they decide to do is him and his girlfriend have a bunch of other friends that decide to come and start visiting them in Macapa from Russia. And eventually they get scared because their friends get pissed off, but who owns the grocery store? Who's going to take the money? And they decide that they want to travel to the light, up the jungle and go deep into the jungle and hide from their friends. So as they do, they get lost in Manaus. Now you'll see there's two branches of the they decide that they're terrified of their cell phones because they think the government's going to get them, and a bunch of things like this. So eventually they get lost, and there's two channels, and they actually decide that because they're along the river on this side, and they actually get lost, and they end up going up north, and they actually end up over in Venezuela. So that's kind of the start of the story. I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but I just wanted to get a little bit into it tonight. If you want to read the script, I'm going to post that online here, and you can take a look at the script in a little bit more detail later tonight. But basically, you'll see that there's a whole history about when they get lost. I'll just go to the end of the story. Sorry to burst. Well, maybe I won't tell you the end of the story yet, but basically they discovered there's all these weird parts of the world that they never heard of, never knew about, and it turns out that it all ends in this lightning lake, and they realize that this lake is a very spiritually important lake. And this is part of the jungle experience here, is that getting lost in the jungle is not an easy thing to talk about. It's very dangerous. So you can see that there's definitely some different river up here, and they end up over here, and then they end up here heading into Venezuela. And then from Venezuela they realize, we're going to have to become Venezuelan, and they don't even know how to barely speak Portuguese because they landed in Brazil, and now they realize that most of South America is actually Spanish speaking, and they're actually Russians. So anyway, this has happened all over the world. There's places like Phuket, Thailand, Bali, Indonesia. It's already happening. There's a mass exodus. You can start to see Russians all over the world essentially trying to leave their own countries, and that's probably not really talked about, but we need to try to help them not only be happy who they are as Russians, but also try to work together on a peaceful process so that we can get this war resolved as soon as possible. Would be great. So anyway, so there's a whole bunch of other stories. I'm going to try to go into more detail later. I think that's all I want to talk about tonight. But here's some of the beauty of some of these cities that we're going to try to film in and do the project at. You can see some of these churches and some of the other areas. This is in one of the weird islands that we might try to do filming on, another very mysterious island near the Lightning Lake. And then here is the amazing city called Maracaibo. There's a town called Maracaibo, and there's actually a bridge and some really cool stuff there. And it's actually one of the most dangerous places to film in the world because the government is not really even a legitimate government, or I don't want to say that way, but I don't know how to say it in Spanish anyway, so hopefully they'll translate this correctly in the live version that is translated. So I did put some of the Portuguese script here, so if you wanted to read some of that in Portuguese, as well as the Russian translated version here in terms of exactly what we're trying to do. And there's definitely quite a story that we want to have as a follow-up story about this new area called a new land called AYX, and that's the name for star actually. So we want to call the new name of Russia in this film AYX, so we might even rename it film, and I'll actually just do that right now. I'm not going to say that that's the film, but AYX. So that's kind of the other possible name of the film here. So anyway, and there's kind of a funny reason for that. You can read about this. It has some profanity in it, and I definitely didn't want to include that, but I was trying to explain it in pretty clear detail about what the whole point of the story was. And hopefully some of it will be pretty funny and interesting if you try to read it. Thank you so much for talking with me and working with me on this. I'll be right back in a little bit. I'm not going to close it out just yet, just in case there's a couple questions regarding what this whole story is all about. In the future, I'm going to try to do video chat and do live discussion to see like what we can do to work together. We're going to try to put these up on the internet and basically discuss them live as we work on the film together. So again, I wanted to mention that I want to work with actual people in Russia, people in Brazil, and actually people in South America on this film, and actually Muslims in Turkey. So there's a lot of different people to collaborate with. We have to try to work peacefully, and also in Ukraine potentially, and trying to make it all 100% legal and awesome to work on.